Script title: The Vertical Trap. How a Glitch Killed the Zero. The humid air over the jungles of New Guinea in early 1943 was not just hot, it was suffocating. A thick blanket of steam that clung to the skin of every man stationed in the Southwest Pacific area. But for Second Lieutenant Richard Bong, sitting in the cramped cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, the heat was the least of his worries, because at 20,000 feet, the air was freezing and the sky was filled with sharks. He checked his six, his heart hammering against his ribs like a piston firing out of rhythm. Behind him, slicing through the clouds with terrifying agility, was the silhouette that haunted the nightmares of every Allied aviator, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. For the first year of the war, this Japanese fighter had been a phantom, a machine that seemed to defy the laws of physics, turning tighter than thought possible and dancing around the heavy, sluggish American iron. At this moment, Richard Bong was not the legendary quote-unquote ace of aces he would later become. He was just a young man in a desperate situation, caught in a lethal game of cat and mouse, where the mouse weighed several tons and the cat was made of paper-thin aluminum and pure aggression. The Japanese pilot behind him knew the game well. He knew that if the American tried to turn, the Zero would cut inside the arc and shred the P-38's twin booms with 20mm cannon fire. The P-38 was fast, powerful, and heavily armed, but in a twisting dogfight, it was a muscle car trying to outmaneuver a motorcycle. Bong's knuckles turned white on the stick. The tracer rounds from the Zero zipped past his canopy, bright, deadly streaks of light signaling that his time was running out. Instinct screamed at him to brake hard, to pull back on the stick and bank away. But training and the grim reality of the Zero's performance told him that was a death sentence. In that split second of panic, where the line between life and death is thinner than the fuselage skin, Richard Bong did something that went against every basic rule of flight training he had ever received. He didn't pull back. He didn't turn. Instead, he shoved the stick violently forward, burying it into the instrument panel. He threw his massive P-38 into a violent inverted dive, flipping the heavy fighter onto its back and plummeting straight toward the green hell of the jungle floor below. It was a move born of pure desperation, a maneuver that should have been suicidal. As the G-forces slammed him into his harness, blood rushing to his head in a painful red out. He braced for the impact of cannon shells tearing through his tail, but the shots never came. He glanced up, or rather down, relative to the earth, and saw the Zero. The Japanese plane had tried to follow, dipping its nose to pursue the kill, but then, inexplicably, it faltered. A puff of black smoke coughed from the Zero's engine cowling. The enemy plane shuddered, lost momentum, and fell behind, its propeller spinning uselessly against the air. Bong leveled out thousands of feet below, his engines roaring with uninterrupted power, alive and bewildered. He had just discovered the Achilles heel of the most feared aircraft in the Pacific, not through superior firepower, but through a glitch in physics that would change the course of the air war forever. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we have to step back and look at the terrifying landscape of the Pacific War in 1942 and early 1943. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was not just a plane. It was a myth built on terrifying reality. When the war began, Allied intelligence had dismissed Japanese aviation as inferior, believing their aircraft were poor copies of Western designs. They were dead wrong. The Zero was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. It sacrificed everything: armor plating for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, structural durability, for two things: range and maneuverability. It could fly for thousands of miles and turn on a dime. In the early days, from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, British and American pilots flying Buffaloes, Wildcats, and P-40s were slaughtered. The kill ratio was abysmal. If you got into a turning fight with a Zero, you died. It was that simple. The psychological impact was devastating. Allied pilots began to believe the Zero was invincible, a supernatural force that could not be shaken. The morale in the mess halls was as low as the grave. But machines, no matter how brilliantly designed, are subject to the laws of mechanics. And the Zero had a hidden flaw deep within its heart, specifically inside its Nakajima Sakae engine. This brings us to a critical question about warfare and innovation. Do you think the outcome of battles is decided more by the courage of the men in the machine or by the technical limitations of the machine itself? It is a debate that has raged for centuries. Pause for a second and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Is it the pilot or the plane that makes the ace? While you ponder that, let's look under the hood of these two warbirds, because the secret to Richard Bong's survival lay in a piece of technology no bigger than a shoebox: the carburetor. The engine of the Zero, like most aircraft engines of the 1930s, used a float-type carburetor. Think of it like the tank on your toilet at home. There is a float that sits on top of the fuel. When the level drops, the float drops, opening a valve to let more fuel in. It relies on gravity and a stable orientation to work. When a plane flies level or pulls positive G's, like in a sharp upward turn, gravity or centrifugal force pushes the fuel down, and the float works perfectly. But when a pilot pushes the nose down hard, entering a sudden dive, they experience negative G-force. Everything floats up. The pilot strains against the seat belts. Dust on the floor creates a cloud in the cockpit. And crucially, the float in the carburetor rises, shutting off the fuel valve. The engine is instantly starved. It coughs, sputters, and cuts out. For the Japanese pilot chasing Bong, that split second of negative G's was catastrophic. His engine died exactly when he needed it most. On the other side of this duel was the P-38 Lightning, the fork-tailed devil, as the Luftwaffe would later call it, or two planes, one pilot, as the Japanese described it. It was a beast of a machine, utilizing twin Allison V1 710 engines. But the P-38 had a secret weapon that wasn't a gun. It used pressure carburetors and later direct fuel injection systems. These systems did not rely on a float or gravity. They pumped fuel directly into the cylinders under pressure, regardless of the plane's orientation. A P-38 pilot could fly upside down, do loops, or push into a violent negative G dive, and his engines would keep purring without missing a beat. This technical disparity created a tactical window, a literal blind spot in the Zero's performance envelope. When Richard Bong pushed that stick forward, he dragged the fight into a realm where the Zero physically could not function. Richard Bong, a farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, wasn't the type to keep this discovery to himself. He was a natural aviator a man who once looped his P-38 around the Golden Gate Bridge just because he could, and blew the laundry off a woman's clothesline while buzzing her house, a woman he later married. In the muddy airfields of the Pacific, information was life, as this tactic, known technically as the inverted dive or the split S entry, began to circulate among the squadrons. The tide began to turn. It wasn't an official doctrine written in a manual at the Pentagon. It was knowledge passed from survivor to survivor in the humidity of the briefing huts. The mantra changed. No longer did American pilots try to outturn the Japanese. The new rule was stay high, stay fast. If a Zero gets on your tail, do not turn. Roll inverted and dive. The Zero pilot, if he tries to follow you immediately, will have his engine cut out. He will lag. By the time his engine catches again, you are 2,000 feet below, accelerating past 400 miles per hour, using the heavy weight of the P-38 to gain massive kinetic energy. Then you pull up, using that speed to climb back to altitude, looking down on the stalled, slow Zero. You have turned the tables. You are no longer the prey. You are the hunter. This shift in tactics coincided with the arrival of better American aircraft and the attrition of elite Japanese pilots. But the inverted dive was the psychological breaker. It shattered the myth of the Zero's invincibility. Pilots like Bong, Thomas Maguire, and Charles McDonnell began racking up kills with frightening efficiency. The statistics from this period paint a brutal picture of this reversal. In early 1942, for every 1 Zero shot down, the Allies lost nearly 1 aircraft. It was a war of attrition they were losing. By late 1943 and into 1944, after the adoption of energy fighting tactics like the inverted dive and the Thatch weave, a lateral scissors maneuver developed by John Thatch, the kill ratio exploded. In some engagements, it went as high as 10-1 in favor of the Americans. The P-38 Lightning specifically became the scourge of the Japanese Air Force, credited with destroying more Japanese aircraft than any other fighter in the Pacific theater. Richard Bong himself would go on to score 40 confirmed kills, making him the top scoring American ace of all time. He didn't do it by being a flashy dogfighter who wrestled with Zeros. He did it by being a disciplined executioner who exploited the mechanical weakness of his enemy. If you are finding this deep dive into the mechanics of history fascinating, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps us get these stories out to more history buffs like you and supports the channel in creating more in-depth content. The legacy of this tactical evolution goes beyond just the kill counts. It represents a fundamental shift in the philosophy of air warfare. The Japanese had built a samurai sword, sharp, agile, and deadly in a duel. The Americans had built a sledgehammer, heavy, fast, and technologically robust. For a long time, the sword cut the sledgehammer to ribbons. But once the Americans learned how to swing the hammer, using gravity, negative G's, and fuel injection, the sword shattered. The inverted dive proved that in modern warfare, knowing your enemy's machine is just as important as knowing his strategy. It was a victory of engineering application over pure aerodynamic agility. The Japanese refused to update the Zero significantly until it was too late, sticking to their doctrine of maneuverability, while the U.S. focused on speed, power, and technical resilience. By the time the Japanese introduced improved carburetors and newer planes like the Ki-84 Frank, the veteran cadre of their pilots was gone, shot down by Americans who had learned to stop playing the Zero's game. We must also remember the cost. Richard Bong, the hero of this narrative, survived the horrors of combat, only to die in a test flight of a P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter on August 6, 1945, the remarkably same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He was 24 years old. His story, and the story of the tactic that saved thousands of American lives, serves as a reminder that innovation in war is often written in blood. It is not always the result of a scientist in a lab coat. Sometimes it is a terrified 20-year-old kid in a cockpit, pushing a stick forward when every instinct tells him to pull back, and in doing so, discovering the key to victory. The air war in the Pacific was not won solely by the atomic bomb or the aircraft carriers. It was won in these individual moments of adaptation. It was won because pilots like Bong learned to turn their aircraft's weight into a weapon and the enemy's engine design into a fatal flaw. The Zero went from being the hunter of the skies to a target, floating helplessly for those few critical seconds while its engine choked, waiting for the boom and zoom of a P-38 returning with a vengeance. There are hundreds of other tactical innovations that turned the tide of World War II. From the hedgerow cutters on tanks in Normandy to the proximity fuses in anti-aircraft shells. If you want to uncover more of these hidden turning points, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell right now. You do not want to miss our upcoming video on how a single broken code message led to the ambush at Midway. Join us next time as we continue to dissect the history of warfare, one strategy at a time.